A judge in cuffs, a billionaire exposed, a courtroom turned battlefield. But the real villain, still in the shadows. Justice is never simple, and Karoline Leavitt is about to learn just how deep corruption runs. Watch till the end to uncover the shocking truth, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping stories. What would you do in her place? Let's discuss. The storm in the courtroom, the gavel slammed down like a gunshot. The sound echoed through the grand courtroom, bouncing off the marble walls, settling uneasily over the audience. Karoline Leavitt stood tall, spine straight, face unreadable. But inside, her mind was calculating, analyzing, and preparing for war. Because that's what this was. A battle. Not just against Charles Lawson, the man sitting smugly at the defense table, a real estate tycoon who had siphoned millions in taxpayer money into his own pockets. Not just against his team of elite, cutthroat attorneys who had been paid fortunes to make sure their client walked free. The real battle today was against the man sitting behind the bench, Judge Richard Gates. The name alone commanded fear in the legal world. He wasn't just a judge, he was an empire. His rulings shaped careers, crushed ambitions, and decided the fate of billion-dollar corporations. He had friends in high places, people who owed him favors, people who would protect him if things ever got messy. But Karoline wasn't here to make friends. She was here to burn his empire to the ground. As she approached the plaintiff's table, the air in the courtroom felt thick, suffocating. Everyone knew this wasn't just another case, it was a war zone. Gates didn't even look at her. Instead, he deliberately flipped through a case file, slowly, methodically, like a predator toying with its prey. The insult was clear: you don't matter. But Karoline had seen this tactic before. She knew men like him thrived on intimidation. She knew the way they loved to control the tempo of the room, loved to make people sweat under their gaze. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Then finally, without looking up, he spoke. "Miss Levit," Gates drawled, his voice dripping with mockery, "I trust you have something worth my time today. Or should we just skip to the part where you waste it?" The defense attorneys chuckled under their breath. Lawson smirked, his fingers drumming against the table. So confident, so sure that his safety net was still intact. Karoline's jaw clenched, but she didn't bite back. She had spent years mastering the art of patience. She took a slow breath and met the judge's eyes. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself." Gates smirked, leaning back lazily, as if he was already bored. "Taxpayer dollars, huh? Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." The insult was obvious, but Karoline didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor, felony corruption charges are hardly frivolous." The tension in the room spiked. For the first time, the murmur of the gallery faded into silence. Even the journalists, hunched over their notepads, had stopped writing. Because this wasn't normal. Judges could be harsh, even cold. But this was personal. Why? Karoline studied Gates carefully. His expression was unreadable, but something about his posture, about the deliberate way he was pushing back so aggressively, so early in the trial, made something click in her mind. This wasn't about her. This wasn't about the case. Gates was protecting something, or someone. She wasn't sure what, but she would find out. Karoline turned toward the jury, keeping her voice measured and controlled. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork?" Gates cut in, smirking. "Or is this just your way of compensating?" Lawson's attorneys exchanged smug glances. The smirk on Lawson's face grew wider. They thought they had won already, but Karoline saw something they didn't. It was subtle, so small it could be dismissed as nothing. But when she placed the financial documents on the table, Gates's fingers twitched. Recognition. Panic. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. And that's when she knew. Judge Richard Gates wasn't just protecting Charles Lawson. He was part of this. The first signs of a crack: for the next 30 minutes, the courtroom became a battlefield. Every piece of evidence Karoline tried to submit, Gates shut it down. Every witness she called, Gates questioned their credibility. Every motion she filed, Gates dismissed it before she even finished speaking. And yet, despite his arrogance, Despite the power he wielded over this courtroom, Karoline could feel the shift happening. Because the more he fought, the more people started paying attention. The jury had stopped taking notes. The gallery had gone eerily silent. Even the defense attorneys, who had started this trial looking confident, were beginning to glance nervously at each other. Because Gates wasn't acting like a judge anymore. He was acting like a man trapped in a corner. Karoline took a slow breath, adjusting a document on her desk. And then she went for the kill. She picked up the next folder, a confidential financial report obtained through a subpoena. She knew this one was dangerous. Not for Lawson, for Gates. She placed the document on the projector screen, the numbers lighting up on the wall for everyone to see. "Your Honor," she began, "this contract outlines the proposed expenses for the city-funded project in question. The listed total here is just over $2 million. She clicked to the next page. "However, this is the internal ledger from the defendant's company. And as you can see, the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount." A murmur spread through the room. Karoline turned the page again, and this time she let the moment stretch, let the weight of it settle over the courtroom like a bomb waiting to detonate. "And here," she said slowly, pointing to the bottom of the document, "is the approval signature." Silence. Signed by Judge Richard Gates. For the first time in his career, Gates didn't have a response. The trap tightens. The courtroom was suffocating in its silence. A ripple of unease slithered through the gallery. Some of the jurors shifted in their seats. The defense attorneys, who had been so smug just moments ago, were now sitting unnaturally still. Judge Richard Gates had not moved. His name, his signature, was on that document, and for the first time, the once untouchable judge had nothing to say. Karoline held his gaze unflinching. She could see it now, the way his fingers curled into a fist against the bench, the way his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. He had underestimated her. Everyone had. And now, for the first time, the predator was feeling like prey. But Karoline also knew one thing. A wounded animal is the most dangerous kind, and she had just cornered the most powerful man in the room. The first counterattack. Judge Gates exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. He leaned forward, his voice ice cold. "Miss Levitt," he said slowly, his words measured and deliberate, "this document is inadmissible." A beat. Karoline's stomach tensed. He was already trying to bury it. She forced herself to stay calm. "Your Honor," she replied, tilting her head slightly. "On what grounds?" Gates didn't blink. "It was obtained improperly." Karoline's fingers tightened on the desk. "That's incorrect. This document was subpoenaed by my office, signed off by a federal judge." A muscle in Gates's jaw twitched. She had him. But the problem with men like Gates? They didn't lose. "Then it was mishandled," he snapped. "I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court." Gasps. This time it wasn't just a murmur. It was a full-blown reaction. Even the stenographer hesitated, fingers frozen above the keys. Karoline let the silence stretch. Let him feel the weight of every single pair of eyes in the room watching him. Then she did something that sent a shockwave through the courtroom. She smiled. Not in amusement, not in arrogance, but in certainty. She had expected this, and she was ready. A game of power. Karoline reached into her case, pulled out a small recording device, and placed it on the table. Then she pressed play. The voice that filled the courtroom belonged to Judge Richard Gates. "Take care of it. I don't care how. Make sure she never gets her hands on those ledgers." The courtroom exploded. Shocked gasps, whispers, the sound of journalists furiously scribbling notes, a camera flash. But Karoline wasn't looking at the reporters. She was looking at Gates, and for the first time he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the exit. He was thinking about running, but it was too late. She wasn't done yet. Karoline slid a printed transcript across the table toward the bailiff. "Officer Reynolds, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud?" The bailiff hesitated, but then picked up the transcript. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words was suffocating. "We'll take care of her. Levit doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. People started whispering. Reporters scrambled to document the moment. The jury exchanged wide-eyed glances. Judge Gates was still unnaturally still, his knuckles white as he gripped the bench. Karoline didn't give him a chance to recover. She turned to the judge, her voice crisp, unwavering. Your Honor, would you like to explain why your voice is on this recording discussing the suppression of evidence in an ongoing corruption trial? A long, heavy silence. Gates' face was unreadable, but Karoline saw the fear creeping in, and that's when she knew. She had him. The fire spreads, but before anyone could react, before Gates could even open his mouth to deny it, something happened that no one saw coming. A metallic clink sounded from the back of the courtroom. The doors swung open. FBI agents stepped inside. The gallery gasped. One of the agents, a tall man with a no-nonsense expression, walked forward, reaching into his jacket. Karoline barely had time to register what was happening before he spoke. Judge Richard Gates, his voice carried through the courtroom. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. The room erupted into chaos. The final move, Gates shot to his feet. His face had gone ghost white. This is outrageous, he barked, voice shaking. You have no right. The agent cut him off. Sir, you have the right to remain silent. A murmur swept through the room. Gates looked around, desperately searching for an ally, a friend, someone who would stand up and call this a mistake. But no one did. Not the jury, not the reporters, not even the defense team. Because it wasn't a mistake. It was justice, and Karoline had delivered it. She watched as the officers reached for his arms. She watched as they snapped the cuffs around his wrists. And for the first time in his long, powerful career, Judge Richard Gates was powerless. The game isn't over. Karoline turned her gaze to Charles Lawson, the man who had been sitting so smugly all morning. But now he looked like he was going to be sick, because his shield, his untouchable protector, was gone, and Karoline wasn't finished yet. She leaned in, voice calm but lethal. Would you like to continue with today's proceedings, Mr. Lawson? Lawson swallowed hard, his eyes darting wildly between the empty judge's seat and the FBI agents leading Gates out of the courtroom. He licked his lips. I want protection. Karoline's lips curled into a small, victorious smile. Then start talking. The breaking point. The metal of the handcuffs clinked against Judge Gates' wrists, echoing through the silent courtroom like a death knell. He had spent years controlling this space, deciding fates with a flick of his gavel, commanding absolute authority. And now he was being dragged out of his own courtroom like a common criminal. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because she knew one thing for certain. A wounded beast is at its most dangerous before it falls. And right now, Gates was still dangerous. The last desperate move. As the FBI agents guided him toward the exit, something shifted. Gates, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly twisted violently. No! He bellowed, his voice hoarse. You can't do this! This is a setup! One of the agents tightened his grip, but Gates wasn't done. He turned, his eyes wild, bloodshot, desperate, and locked onto Karoline. You think you're winning? He snarled. You think this is over? You have no idea what you've just done. A ripple of unease spread through the room, because something about his tone felt like a threat. Karoline's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. If you have anything to say, Your Honor, I'd suggest saving it for your trial. Gates let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Trial? He scoffed. There won't be a trial. You think I'm the only one? You think I did this alone? You have no idea what you're up against. And then he said something that sent an icy chill down Karoline's spine. You should start looking over your shoulder, Miss Levit. The courtroom went dead silent. Even the agents paused. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Then, one of the agents yanked him forward, snapping Gates out of his moment of defiance. But the damage was done. He had planted a seed of doubt, of danger, and Karoline knew with chilling certainty that this was far from over. The chaos begins. As soon as Gates was hauled out of the courtroom, the room exploded into chaos. Journalists scrambled for their phones, calling in the biggest legal scandal in years. The jury whispered among themselves, their impartiality shattered. Even the defense attorneys, who had once looked untouchable, were now whispering frantically, their massive confidence crumbling. But Karoline wasn't focused on them. She was focused on Charles Lawson. The real estate mogul had gone pale, his fingers gripping the edges of the table so hard his knuckles had turned white. Karoline took a slow step toward him. "Would you like to continue with today's proceedings, Mr. Lawson?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally his voice came out, strained, shaking. "I want protection." Karoline tilted her head. "Then start talking." But before he could, his lead attorney, a man in an expensive three-piece suit, stood up sharply. "My client will not be making any statements without proper legal counsel." Lawson shot up. "Sit down." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The attorney blinked in shock. "Mr. Lawson, I strongly advise—" "I said sit down," Lawson roared. His voice boomed through the courtroom, his composure snapping like a dry twig. And that's when Karoline knew. He was unraveling. The confession that changed everything. Lawson ran a shaky hand through his graying hair, his breathing uneven. "You think I wanted this?" He spat, glaring at Karoline. "You think I had a choice?" The room went still. Karoline folded her arms, watching him closely. "Why don't you explain it to us?" Lawson let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You really don't get it, do you?" Karoline waited. And then he said it. "I wasn't working for Gates." A shock wave went through the courtroom. For a moment, Karoline thought she misheard him. "What?" Lawson's chest rose and fell rapidly. "Gates wasn't the one pulling the strings," he whispered. "He was just the middleman." Everything inside Karoline went still. The courtroom, the case, the victory she thought she had just won. It wasn't enough, because Gates wasn't the top of the chain. There was someone above him, and whoever they were still out there. The aftermath, a darker game revealed. As soon as Lawson uttered those words, his attorneys went ballistic. One of them slammed his hand on the table. "This conversation is over." But it was too late. The FBI agents, who had been standing silently near the back of the courtroom, moved forward. One of them, a woman in a navy suit, placed a hand on Lawson's shoulder. "Mr. Lawson," she said smoothly, "if you're willing to provide information, we'd be happy to discuss protection terms." Lawson hesitated, then he nodded. Karoline exhaled slowly. She had just pulled a thread, and it had unraveled something far, far bigger than she had ever imagined. She should have felt victorious. But instead, she felt uneasy, because now she had a new enemy, and she had no idea who they were. The final reckoning. The courtroom was no longer just a battleground. It was the scene of an unraveling empire. Judge Richard Gates was gone, hauled out in handcuffs like the criminals he had once condemned. Charles Lawson had broken, spilling a secret that no one in the room had expected. The trial that was supposed to be a high-profile corruption case had transformed into something far more sinister. There was someone else out there. Someone bigger, more powerful, more dangerous. And Karoline Leavitt had just made herself their enemy. The aftershocks, Lawson was escorted out of the courtroom under FBI protection, his once proud, smug expression now hollow and drained. The reporters in the back had completely abandoned their notepads in favor of scrambling for their phones, calling in the biggest political scandal of the decade. But Karoline barely heard them, because even as victory hung in the air, she felt something far heavier pressing down on her. Gates' last words echoed in her mind. "You should start looking over your shoulder." A warning, or worse, a promise. The offer she didn't expect as she gathered her notes. One of the FBI agents, the tall, sharp-eyed man who had arrested Gates, walked toward her. He slipped a card onto her desk. "You need to come with us." Karoline looked up. "Excuse me?" He motioned toward the doors where a group of agents stood waiting. "There's something you need to see." The room full of secrets. 15 minutes later, Karoline found herself in a sterile, windowless briefing room deep inside a federal building. A file was placed in front of her. She hesitated. Then she opened it. And what she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't just Lawson's name in the records. It wasn't just Judge Gates's name either. It was a list A long, painstakingly detailed list of judges, prosecutors, senators, corporate CEOs, all of them connected to the same corrupt network. And at the very top of the list, a name she never expected. The name that changed everything her breath caught in her throat. Senator William Prescott, a man who had spent years positioning himself as a champion of justice, a crusader against corruption, a man who had been whispered as a future presidential candidate, a man who had personally congratulated Karoline on her persistence and integrity in fighting corruption just last year. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. Wire transfers, off-the-books transactions, offshore accounts, bribes disguised as political donations. Prescott wasn't just involved. He was the architect, the mastermind, the one who had kept people like Gates and Lawson in power. And now Karoline had proof. She had everything she needed to take him down. But at what cost? The decision that could kill her. The FBI agent across from her, Agent Ryan Cross, studied her carefully. "This is bigger than a courtroom, Levitt." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You need to understand what you're stepping into." She swallowed. "How long have you known?" Cross hesitated. "Long enough to know that people who dig too deep don't always make it out." The weight of his words settled into her bones. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a war, and the people at the top of this conspiracy wouldn't go down quietly. She thought about Gates, Lawson, and then she thought about Prescott, a man with an entire political machine behind him, a man who had built his power on silencing people like her. If she took this public, if she pursued it, she wouldn't just be fighting in a courtroom anymore. She would be fighting for her life. The choice agent Cross leaned forward. "If you go after Prescott, you'll be putting a target on your back. He doesn't just have money, he has people, leverage, influence. You'll be up against more than just lawyers." Karoline exhaled slowly. She knew that already. She had always known the moment this case became bigger than just Lawson. She could walk away now. She could hand over the evidence, let someone else fight this war. She could go back to her normal life. But normal had never been an option for her, and she wasn't about to start backing down now. She pushed the file back toward Cross. "What do we do next? The end, or just the beginning?" As Karoline stepped out into the cold evening air, she knew this wasn't over. The people at the top of the food chain weren't just corrupt. They were dangerous. And now they knew her name. She was no longer just a prosecutor. She was a threat. A storm was coming, and she was ready for it.